My name's Féilim. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Applied Social Studies at University College Cork, and I teach a range of subjects, but one of the subjects I teach, or two of the subjects I teach, relate to human rights law, the weakness and strengths, international human rights law, and also conflict and conflict resolution. And what I wanted to talk today about was what do we mean when we start talking about international law, and in particular international human rights law and international humanitarian law, which is the law which relates primarily to rights during a conflict or a war. And I suppose the title is International Law, Neither Law Nor International. And the reason I'm suggesting that is that the law that we talk about in inverted commas is law which is created by a few big powers in the world, particularly the USA and the Western Alliance. They're the ones who make the law, in inverted commas. And they encourage all others by threat or by buying them off to support this law. But the problem with this law is that it's made by a small number of nations, so it's not international in the sense of its making. And the other thing about it is that it's not law in the sense that it doesn't apply equally to different countries. At the time of the Magna Carta, for example, in England, the whole argument at that time against the king was that the king could arbitrarily use the law to suit his own interests. And the idea behind the Magna Carta, or at least part of the idea behind the Magna Carta, was that everybody would be amenable to the law, would be subject to the law equally. It didn't matter whether they were king or whether they weren't a king. And one of the difficulties with international law, whether it be human rights law, humanitarian law, or any type of international law, is that the big powers decide who is going to be sanctioned, who is going to be punished if they break the law, and they themselves consistently break the law. The other element of this, when I said that it's the big powers that make the law, if you look at international human rights law, it is in the main based on Western ideas of human rights, notions of individual freedoms from the state, political rights, political freedoms, etc., rather than collectivist rights, rather than social and economic rights. And as I say, it's not law because it applies unequally to different countries. Some are sanctioned, some are not. And thus we'll have a situation where, for example, Russia is currently sanctioned. There are trade sanctions, there are bans from international sporting and cultural events due to the invasion of Ukraine. Yet the USA was not sanctioned for its many invasions and attacks on countries since World War II, including Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And Israel, of course, is not sanctioned or banned from sporting or cultural events, but in fact is armed and supported by the West, despite its occupation, which has been described as illegal by the UN, including the UN Security Council, on which the US sits and other Western powers sit. Despite its attacks, ongoing attacks on Palestine, on Syria, on Iran, and on Lebanon. Here are some of the countries that USA has bombed since the end of World War II without any form of sanction whatsoever. The big powers have been involved in recent wars, and there's a list of those that I've placed on the slide here, which you can have a look at, but you already know about. The two big ones, big conflicts that are ongoing at the moment that we know about, that big powers are involved in, is the war in Ukraine, really ongoing since 2013, since the overthrow of an elected president there, after he refused to sign a deal with the EU, and then exacerbated by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. And then the other war, of course, is Palestine, and then that's spread to other parts of the Middle East with attacks on Syria, with attacks on Iranian targets, and with attacks on Lebanon at the moment. And again, there are no sanctions, no international sanctions for the breaking of law, of international law in these particular cases. We've had a number of judgments from the International Court of Justice in relation to Israel, for example, in relation to the building of a separation wall, basically around the Palestinian occupied territories. And that separation wall takes up 85% of that separation wall is built on the occupied territories rather than in Israel. Ostensibly, that separation wall was built to protect Israel from attack from Palestinians. But in actual fact, what it has done is it has created small, separated towns and villages and entities within the occupied territories, which prevent Palestinians from travelling from one part of the occupied territories to the other. This is a map in terms of, maybe I'll go on just in relation to, there's a couple of maps here which show the complicated nature of the Ukrainian war. That basically it's geopolitical in the sense that we have the West, the EU countries and the USA supporting the Ukrainian government in Kiev or Kyiv, whatever the pronunciation you want to use. And then you have Russia, to a large extent isolated in the world because of the sanctions. But with both those sides, if you like, in the war have geopolitical interests in trying to promote their own particulars, the Russians and the West. But even within Ukraine itself, there are major divisions, and this map and the map after it show those divisions because large sections of Ukraine are made up of Russian-speaking peoples, and any attempt to create a unified Ukraine must take on board the fact that we've got minorities which are often majorities within some sections of Ukraine. And you can see here some of the ethnic minorities which exist within Ukraine. This is one of the elections for presidency, and you can see how divided Ukraine was in relation to that. The Russian speaking and the Ukrainian speaking candidates. In the east, you've got support for the Russian speaking candidates, in the west for the Ukrainian speaking candidates. And this is the presidential election 2010 as well, you can see from this. Okay. The other thing to mention when we were talking about international law, I mentioned a small number of powers actually decide what is international law and decides who gets sanctioned and who doesn't get sanctioned. The real power in the UN and in international law are the permanent members of the UN Security Council. And there are 5 permanent members who can veto sanctions. The overall UN Security Council is the only body that can pass sanctions that can include military action against the country. The UN Security Council is the only body that can recognise a state, and it can also decide on the borders of states. And if one of the permanent members, the 5 permanent members, which includes Russia, China, France, Britain, and the USA, if one of those permanent members passes a veto, then it can stop sanctions, it can impose sanctions, depending on whether it uses that veto or not. It can also decide whether a state gets recognised or not. The Irish state, for example, which is where I happen to live, became a republic in 1948. It was recognised by its previous ruler, Britain, in 1948, and also by the Irish state itself. But it didn't become a member of the UN. It wasn't accepted as a member of the UN until 1955, and that was because of a veto from Russia, because Russia felt that it was part of the Western Bloc and were potentially going to vote on the Western Bloc. As a result of that, it wasn't recognised as a state by the UN. China, the People's Republic of China, as we know, it wasn't recognised as a state by the UN until 1971, because the old Taiwan nationalist government had been recognised by the state prior to the revolution in 1949, and the USA refused to cast its veto and prevented China from being actually represented by the government of China, which is a bit strange, but anyway. And that's happening in a lot of states as well, a lot of other countries as well. I wanted to particularly use Israel-Palestine as an example of where international law isn't international law and where it's fulfilling that law. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a brief history of that particular conflict. People probably already know about it, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But start off with where this idea of Israel, of an Israel state or a state called Israel emerges from. It really emerges from persecution of Jewish people in Europe. And as a result of that, you see the development of a Zionist movement in the 19th century, which is based on the notion of a national homeland for Jewish people where they'll be safe from persecution. And initially, a whole range of different countries were considered for this national homeland. Argentina, for example, was considered. Uganda was considered. Before the Zionist movement settled on historic Palestine. And at that time, historic Palestine was controlled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. It had been controlled by that empire since 1516. In 1918, that empire collapsed because Turkey had sided with Germany during the First World War, and Germany had lost and Turkey had lost. And the Ottoman Empire was broken up. It was broken up by the winning powers of World War I, particularly Britain and France. In the late 1880s, the new Zionist movement in Europe began to buy up land in Palestine and organize small-scale immigration there as a homeland for Jews. And whenever the Ottoman Empire was broken up after the Second World War, Britain and France, is just a map of the Ottoman Empire as it was. Britain and France, as the winning powers, really, they divided up the Middle East based on their own particular strategic and geopolitical interests. And now one of the interesting factors in relation to this dividing up when it came to Palestine was that in 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, Britain had promised the Arab lands under Ottoman rule independence if they sided with the British against the Turks. And that included Palestine. So in return for Arab support, Palestine would have independence. That was the suggestion in 1914. Then in 1916, Britain and France signed a secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which basically divided up these regions into their own zones of influence. And Lebanon and Syria were assigned to France, Jordan and Iraq to Britain, and Palestine was supposed to be internationalised. At the same time, or just a year later, this is an example of how the Middle East was divvied up by France and Britain without any recourse to the local populations at the time. Okay. At the same time, around about the same time, 1917, there was the Balfour Declaration. And this was a letter to the British Zionist leader, Lord Rothschild, by the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, which basically said that the British government would favour the establishment of a state in Palestine as a national home for Jewish people. And a lot of Palestinians will look back to that particular declaration as the start of their woes, shall we say. The British government had promised, therefore, both the Palestinians in 1914 and the Jewish people in 1917 the land of Palestine as a homeland, while at the same time having agreed with France to carve up the Middle East between them. This is one of the problems with colonialism in dealing with local native populations, etc. After the Second World War, Britain was was given control over Palestine. It's called the Palestine Mandate, and it held that control from 1922 to 1947. And during that period, there was large-scale Jewish immigration into Palestine, mainly from Eastern Europe. And again, this starts to increase dramatically during the 1930s with Nazi persecution of Jewish people. This immigration then, in turn, leads to increasing demands for independence from Palestinians, as well as resistance to Jewish immigration. And you end up with conflict on all sides in that particular region. And after the Second World War, you see a massive movement for the establishment of a Jewish state, particularly because of Jewish refugees. It was estimated in a UN report in 1947 that there were 250,000 Jewish people in assembly points waiting to get into Palestine. And one of the things we need to consider in relation to the creation of Palestine was, yes, the empathy, the sympathy that Western European countries had for Jewish people, because whenever the stories start to come out about the concentration camps, the gas chambers, the final solution, more and more people are arguing that something needs to be done for the Jewish people in Europe. Remember, again, it's Europeans that are doing all this persecuting during the Second World War. And what happens then whenever the concentration camps are open? You've got hundreds of thousands of Jewish people roaming around Europe as refugees. Their homes have been taken from them. Often they've been destroyed. Often their land and their possessions have been taken by Europeans. And Europe doesn't know what to do with all these refugees. And an easy solution, really, combined with the sympathy, is to send them to Palestine, basically. And what happens is pressure from European states about what to do with the refugees, and pressure from Zionists, particularly in America, with the support of the American government, leads to the announcement by the new UN, which had just been established in 1945. You had the UN Charter, the establishment of the UN. They decide to investigate what should be done about Palestine and whether there should be a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And you have a special committee on Palestine set up in 1946, and it reports in 1947. And it suggests, the minority report suggests, that there should be two separate states, a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. There was a minority recommendation, which maybe when we think back on it would have been the best solution, which was one federal state. But that was a minority recommendation. One of the things to remember is that, so the idea was to partition Palestine. In 1947, there were only 57 nation states recognized by the UN. Today, there are 183, with two observer non-states. Those two observer non-states are Palestine and the Vatican. So that means that only a minority of the countries today had a vote at the UN in relation to Palestine. And remember, the Palestinians didn't have a vote on Palestine because they didn't have a state. They weren't recognized as a state of the UN. So 57 nation states were going to make a decision on what was going to happen to a country in which there were actually people already living there. The UN report in 1947 stated that there were 65% of the population of Palestine, historic Palestine, were Arabs, and that 65% owned 85% of the land of Palestine. They estimated that 33% of the population were Jewish, mainly immigrants who had come in, or descendants of immigrants had come in during that century, during the 20th century, and they owned less than 5% of the land. And there was no clear territorial separation between Jews and Arabs. And also, Arabs constituted a majority in every area, including the area, the Jaffa area around where is modern day Tel Aviv. So you have a situation where in every area of Palestine, Arabs or Palestinians are in a majority, and they also own 85% of the land. And what the UN proposes is that that 1/3 of the population, which was Jewish people that owned 7% of the land, would then be given 55% of the territory of historic Palestine. So they'd have a majority of the area. And that the 2/3 of the population who owned 85% of the land would have 45%. Now, 33 states voted in favour of this, including the USA, the USSR, France, most Latin American countries. 33 states. There are now 183. No state in the Middle East region voted in favour. Palestinians didn't have a vote. 13 opposed it, including all the Arab states. 10 abstained, including the UK and what was then nationalist China. The resolution was rejected by Arab states, the Arab League and the Palestinian Arabs. They viewed it as a form of European colonialism, and they threatened to oppose it by force. And the resolution was supported by the Zionist lobby. The UN Security Council, which was supposed to have the power to set up states and recognise states, couldn't reach consensus on how to proceed. And meanwhile, what happened was that conflict breaks out in Palestine between the Arabs that live there and the new people coming in, and the Jewish people that had already immigrated there. And you have a war developing. And that war, in that war after 1948, whenever the UK government voted to end its mandate and withdraw its troops in 1948, on the 14th of May, the Zionists in Palestine declared a new state, the State of Israel. And this is without the UN Security Council actually coming to an agreement on this. And the war continued. Jordan joined in the war, and a number of other Arab countries joined in the war, but they were defeated. And instead of ending up with 55% of the territory, the new state, which was established, ended up with the 55% of the partition plan of Palestine allocated to it, plus 60% of the area allocated to the Arab population. It thus expanded itself to 78% of Palestine. Israel actually also occupied the larger part of West Jerusalem. The larger part of Jerusalem, which was West Jerusalem. Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city. It wasn't supposed to be part of either a Palestinian state or an Israeli state. You also ended up with 750,000 of the million Palestinians becoming refugees, with an estimated 400 towns and villages destroyed. So the new state's starting off through conflict, through conquest, through colonialism, if you like, and has already broken the rules of the UN in the sense that it's taken more than 55% of the land that it was allocated in the first place. The UN doesn't sanction the new state. The UN actually recognises the new state, recognises Israel into the UN. And it recognises Israel into the UN under a number of provisos. As I say, just 22% of Palestine is left that hasn't been occupied by Israel in 1948. That's Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem that we know today. No Palestinian state was created, and the Palestinians call this period the Nakba. Okay. In terms of that new state, the UN recognised Israel into the new state under a number of conditions. One of the conditions was that it agreed to accept the UN Security Council Resolution 194 that guaranteed the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes in what had become Israel. And Israel never allowed that to happen, never allowed the Palestinians to come back. In fact, in 1950, Israel passed the Law of Return and Absentee Property Act or property law. And basically what that did was it said that anybody who had left, any Palestinians who had left, their land could be appropriated by the state and used for Jewish settlements and for Jewish settlers. And that's basically what happened in that particular period. Palestinians were now allowed back into the new state when they had moved out. And as a result, their land was therefore confiscated. Okay, a number of refugee camps were set up around the Middle East to accommodate these refugees, and those refugee camps still exist, and now they've grown because those refugees have descendants. And this just gives you some example of some of the refugees, registered refugees. It's reckoned there's about 5.5 million refugees who are registered with the UN at the present time. And they emerged from the 750,000 refugees in 1948, and also the refugees that resulted from the 1967 Six-Day War. Okay, so Israel accepted as a state on the 14th of May 1949 by UN General Assembly resolution, and those were the conditions that that there would be a right of return of refugees. That's UN Security Council Resolution 194, and also the UN General Assembly Resolution 181, which talked about acceptance of the creation of a second state, i.e. a Palestinian state. Despite a large majority of UN member states having voted 3 times to recognise Palestine as a state, the US have voted on the UN Security Council to prevent this happening, used its veto to prevent this happening. That's despite the condition being placed on Israel when it joined the UN that there would be a right of return of refugees and Palestine could have a state and Palestinians could have a state. Okay. 1947, you have a further war, Six-Day War, in which Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, basically. Occupied the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Also occupied the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Desert from Egypt. Eventually, there was a peace agreement with Egypt, which led to the release of the Sinai Desert back to Egypt. Golan Heights was incorporated into Israel, which, according to the UN, was illegal. It's according to the UN, it's Syrian territory. East Jerusalem has also been incorporated into Israel, and since 1967, increasing amounts of the West Bank have been confiscated. Land on the West Bank has been confiscated. Palestinians have been evicted, and settlements have been built. Israel, therefore, in 1967, occupied the remaining 22% of Palestine, left for a Palestinian state, and continues to occupy that 22%. In fact, there's built settlements on it. According to international humanitarian law, you're not supposed to build settlements and confiscate land on occupied territory. This is the reason why, or the argument why, Russia has been sanctioned by America and the Western Bloc for occupying part of the territory and annexing part of the territory of Ukraine. Israel has never been sanctioned by Western countries, by the UN, by the UN or by the USA, and it never had a boycott, for example, by European countries or sanctions of any description. UN Security Council Resolution 242 in 1967 called on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. Israel refused and still refuses. And in fact, it seems to be the case now when we look at what's happening in Gaza and also in the West Bank, the current war, that Israel seems intent on not just occupying those territories, but annexing most, if not all, of the West Bank, when we're not sure what Israel will do with Gaza. That resolution was reiterated with Resolution 338. That's again, these are Security Council resolutions in 1973. Again, talking about the Golan Heights and Sinai, which was later returned to Egypt. Okay. At the present time, this slide shows how Palestinian territory has been lost since 1946. The first map shows the historic Palestine prior to the partition of Palestine. The white areas are Jewish land or Jewish-owned land. The green areas are Palestinian land. And you can see how the control of the land, the ownership of the land changed dramatically from 1946 to 1947, and then to 1967, and then since 1967. And there's some estimates today, because of the continuing confiscation of land in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, that while the occupied territories represent 22% of historic Palestine, and that's been voted on by the UN as the area that should be available for a Palestinian state now, today, that with the settlements, etc., there's probably only about 12% of historic Palestine left, which then raises a whole range of questions as to whether you can actually have a two-state solution at all. Where do all these Palestinians live? And particularly if you're talking about people coming back from refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria, etc., Jordan, where are they going to live? Gaza, the Israelis withdrew. Originally, they had settlements in Gaza, and they withdrew from Gaza at the start of the millennium. But in 2006, they imposed a blockade on Gaza, limiting exports and imports, the movement of people in and out, travel in and out, and also limiting the area that of the Mediterranean that Gazans could fish in. So Gazans aren't allowed to go beyond 3 kilometres off the coast. Now they're not allowed to go even 3 kilometres because of the war, etc. Okay. Just in relation to, I'm coming to the end now, you'll be pleased to know, as of June 2024, the state of Palestine is recognised as a sovereign state by 146 of the 193 member states of the UN. That's about 3/4 of all UN member states, 75%. It has had non-member observer status in the UN General Assembly since 2012, which has allowed it to register with the International Criminal Court, which is one of the reasons why the International Criminal Court is carrying out an investigation into what's happening really in Gaza in the last 2 years. The USA has vetoed its recognition by the UN on 3 different occasions. So although 3/4 of the UN member states have said that it should be a member of the UN, and also a host of UN resolutions to that effect, USA has vetoed that on 3 separate occasions. It's mainly states from Western Europe and the US and their allies who refuse to recognise Palestine as a state. It's not recognised by most of Western Europe, most of the EU, the USA, UK, Canada and Australia. Ireland recognised it in 2024 along with Spain and also a non-EU country, Norway. As of 2024, 14 of the 27 EU member states now recognise Palestine. Sweden was the first country to recognise Palestine while being an EU member, and that was in 2014. Now, you think about it, that there was supposed to be a Palestinian state according to the UN in 1947, to establish the state in 1948. That was the report. And today we're in 2024 and we still don't have an agreement at UN level on a Palestinian state. Okay. There are still close connections between Israel and Europe. US and EU remain strong allies of Europe. The USA provides weaponry and defence systems. I think they've just agreed on another $8 billion in weapons to be sent to Israel, at the same time as saying that they want to have a ceasefire, and in relation to to Gaza and in relation to Lebanon, but 8 billion more in weaponry has been spent. Israel is an associate state of the EU. There's a free trade agreement and research programs. Universities actually engage in collaborative research with Israeli universities as well. Israel takes part in the Eurovision Song Contests, and it takes place in European sports competitions. Again, remember, Russia has been banned from the Eurovision Song Contest. It's in Europe, and it's also been banned from UEFA football, banned from the Olympics, etc. All things that have not happened to Israel, despite breaking all these UN resolutions. There's at least 80 UN Security Council resolutions that Israel has ignored. And not only that, a lot of countries have actually passed them. A lot of European countries also have companies trading in the occupied countries, in the occupied territory settlements, etc. And European countries. In terms of peaceful attempts to try to put pressure on Israel, because this is one of the things that many international NGOs have argued with Palestinians about, that the best way forward for them is to use non-violent means to try to bring about self-determination or bring about a state. And one of the methods promoted by Palestinian NGOs to this end has been the boycott and divestment campaign, boycott of Israeli goods, similar to the boycott that took place of South African goods during apartheid. Many European states have banned the ability of public sector organisations to engage in boycott and disinvestment activities. In fact, not just public sector organisations, some countries have banned private organisations from engaging in this type of behaviour because it's regarded as discriminatory. Even talking about having a Palestinian state or waving a Palestinian flag in some European countries can get you arrested and get you jailed as somehow being anti-Semitic. So it's very, very difficult if you're trying to argue for a peaceful way forward for Palestinians, given the war, given the ongoing wars over a long period of time, given the ongoing confiscations of land and building of settlements, given the lack of interest by the world community, particularly by the rich North. It's very, very difficult to do that. And then, of course, if you're banned from engaging in peaceful activity, then it makes it even more difficult to argue for peaceful activity. Many organisations in the West that support the Palestinian cause have also been banned from entering Israel, which effectively means banned from entering Palestine as well, the occupied territories of Palestine. I'm actually one of the people who's banned, but there are a lot of people who are banned in Ireland from entering Israel. This is, in 2023, the population of Israel-Palestine. It's reckoned that there's 5.48 million, or was recognised, of a Palestinian population in that Israel-Palestine area. And in terms of Jewish people in that Israel-Palestine area, including the settlements, it's reckoned there's 7.5 million. So it works out at a majority in the overall Palestine-Israel region, a majority of Israeli Jews in comparison to Palestinians. But if you add on then the people in the refugee camps registered, then you end up with a Palestinian majority, and of course that causes all sorts of problems. There's some figures here that people may want to look at as well in terms of Palestinians in the world. It's reckoned there's about 12 million Palestinians in the world, right? About 8 million Jewish Israelis, etc. So if there was going to be a Palestinian state, what would be its boundaries? There was a resolution passed at the UN General Assembly in 2004 that 140 votes in favour and 11 abstentions. The vast majority of the UN member states support this idea of state within the pre-1967 borders. Pre-1967 borders mean the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza being your Palestinian state, which is 22% of historic Palestine. And remember that the UN had originally said that a Palestinian state should have 45% of historic Palestine. Okay, so the land available has dwindled, and as I said earlier, some estimate it to be less than 12% of historic Palestine. And then that leads to the argument among some Palestinians, is it possible to have a two-state solution with so little land, 12% of historic Palestine, for 12 million Palestinians? And in fact, will that 12% actually exist by the time Israel's finished with its conquest at the moment? Not funny, but the idea of trying to create a Palestinian state seems increasingly seems to be decreasing every day. There was an argument many, many years ago by the PLO, when the PLO set up in the 1960s, that there should be one secular unitary state in the region. And in fact, interestingly enough, the PLO, one of the members of the PLO was a guy called Yuri Davis, who was a Jew, who was a Palestinian Jew who had lived in Palestine. His family had lived in Palestine for generations. And he was on the PLO executive. The argument as to why you could possibly have a one secular unitary state after all this conflict is up in the air, I suppose, at the moment as well. How would people live together? How would people share the land? Okay, that's it. If anybody's still there, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Féilim, for that very comprehensive discussion analysis. We're up to 1 o'clock, which is, I guess, the anticipated finish time, but given that we've run over slightly and we want to have room for some discussion, I'm going to, what we usually do in this format is to ask our core group, if you like, to comment, but I don't, because of the general, if you like, because of the topic, perhaps I might just throw open the discussion to the floor with a view to maybe up to 10 minutes of discussion, and then we'll close this month's session. So I will now. I'm working from my phone, so I can't easily see the whole. I have to scroll across to see people. So if anybody would like to ask a question of them or make an observation.
Well, I would have a short question or comment. Looking at the title, I would actually say what you presented is a sign that it is international and that it is law. Because international, it is not global. And this is a matter, what you presented, it was just a matter of the powerful nations being interaction and agreeing on something. And this something is law. Because what we should not say that law is, in the tradition of natural law, something that is given. But law is always contested. And in this case, unfortunately, I agree there, and you may say as well, in an unjust way, the stronger powers succeeded, whatever the stronger powers is, and law is a struggle. Law is not something that is given, and in this way, I would say what you presented is just a confirmation. It is international, not global, and it is law, because law is not something that is given and written in stone, but it is contested, and we have to, I think, differentiate this to be able then to address the correct issues. Instead of saying it's not law, it's illegal. it is legal in terms of the legislation that exists, and that is a matter of power.
Can I come back to you? I mean,
Yeah, please.
I suppose my point is that you can write something down and say it's law, but, you know, if nobody abides by it, is it law? You know? I mean, and the other thing about it is that, so what I'm saying is that it doesn't apply everywhere equally. And it doesn't, and some people ignore it, and some people suffer as a result of ignoring it, and some people don't. So, can it be called law? And I suppose we start then getting into, well, what is the definition of law? If you write something down, and say this is a law and nobody abides by it, is it law? If there's no police force, if there's no agreement among the international community to enforce certain laws at certain times in relation to certain countries, then is it really law? I mean, it's certainly not law that abides that covers everybody on the planet, or everybody in the countries that are UN members. In my view, so it is certainly. I agree with you that it is to do. It's a contested site when we talk about international humanitarian law, when we talk about international human rights law, when we talk about international law, as it, you know. I mean, there's arguments over boundaries and borders and all this type of stuff that have always gone on. But I'm talking about, you know, how can you say you've got a law that applies to the international community, like all the countries in the UN, whenever everybody knows it doesn't, that certain countries aren't covered by it? I suppose this is my point. Certain countries aren't covered by it, and certain countries are. But the second thing about it is that, like, who makes this law? You know, and is it really international? You know, do people actually, you know, collaborate on this, or is this simply something that a number of the big powers pushing everybody else and threaten them if they don't agree with it, you know, if they don't vote in favour of it, or else buy them off, which is to a large extent what happened with the Israeli vote in the UN. You know, like a lot of the countries were actually bought off by the Americans, and the Americans, of course, were influenced by the Zionist lobby. So, you know, you have a crazy situation where a minority of nations in the world create massive problems for the rest of the world, and are continuing to do it. And it breaks my heart to say it. Actually, to be honest, I know I'm sort of laughing, but it breaks my heart to say it. You know, that a small number of countries, particularly the United States of America, have caused so much misery in this world. You know, that Russian war, I don't support Putin. I don't agree with Putin at all. But that war could have been prevented. It could have been prevented if people had been interested in peace rather than interested in geopolitical advantage. And that's on all sides. That's on the Western side and the Russian side. But even in terms of Ukraine itself, internally to Ukraine, it's such a large ethnic Russian population, Russian-speaking population. Why develop policies which are nationalistic, right-wing nationalistic policies, which don't include that section of society in your state? And I mention this because I come from a part of the world where this happened. Whenever Northern Ireland was created as an entity, there was no attempt made to incorporate the minority into that entity. If there had been, there might have been peace. There might not be a demand now for a reunited Ireland. I mean, people might have been comfortable there. But that didn't happen. We were excluded. You know, and that's what happened, particularly in Ukraine. because there was a reaction against Russia, a reaction against Russian speakers and ethnic Russians, etc., which didn't help create a unified nation. And that's over and above the whole geopolitical conflict that was going on as well between the great powers. I mean, it just seems to me that, and particularly in that conflict, it could have been prevented, you know,
Okay.
sorry, apologies. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if anybody else has a question or observation. Obviously, we're covering very complex and wide-ranging issues, the nature of law, dear to Peter's heart in particular, and the two other people here, they're talking about the Palestine, Gaza, Israel conflict and the Ukraine conflict, which people have kind of very different and very strongly held opinions. So we're certainly not shying away from controversy here today. So does anybody else have any, as I say, observations? Or Krish, you have your hand up.
Yes. Thank you for the presentation. Really interesting going back through the history. I'm connecting from Cape Town. So my question, I guess, is very much related to South Africa's case at the ICJ against Israel in terms of its accusation of genocide. What do you think that case has actually achieved from your perspective? I mean, from my side, it seems like we've exposed at least this hypocrisy about what this rules-based international law narrative actually is, where we pick and choose which case we support and which case we disavow. So I'd like to get your take on that, please.
I think you're right, to be honest. I mean, I've always been skeptical, and I've always, like Peter has mentioned about the contested side, I've always regarded, for example, international human rights law and international humanitarian law as a contested space, and one in which we should use as tools to advance our cause. If you want to promote human rights, for example, but you're up against powerful economic and political interests in trying to do that. So I've always been quite, I don't like the word cynical, but certainly critical of these conventions and treaties, etc. But in relation to what you say about the Gazan situation, I mean, I think that the big danger is, and I think it is the case, is that international law is no more. You know, that it's just been shown to be a sham. Because the thing about the International Court of Justice ruling, well, its initial ruling anyway, would make you assume that the international community would come together and try to prevent further devastation in that part of the world. I mean, international humanitarian law says that you can engage in a war, but it has to be proportional. I mean, the idea that the majority of your victims are women and children, the idea that a quarter, like 10,000 of your victims, maybe more, are children, some estimates say 20,000 are children, should get people to stop and think. You know, and again, I come from a conflict situation where if one or two children had been killed, there'd be uproar. And yet, the Western world can sit, not even sit. I mean, the EU is the biggest trading partner for Israel. Israel couldn't survive without the EU as a trading partner. The Americans certainly gives it a lot of money, gives it a lot of weapons. Second biggest country to give it weapons is Germany, again, a European country. So, you know, the idea that you can not only just sit back and do nothing, but you actually promoting the conflict by continuing to give weapons to this type of destruction seems to me. I mean, if Israel was killing armed members of Hamas, I'd say people would say, well, if you're an armed member of Hamas, then you're engaged in a war and you expect to die. The same in any conflict. Any conflict, people on either side expect to die or the opportunity, the possibility of death. But if you're blowing up an apartment block full of people, for what reason? Maybe to kill one person. And this isn't new. This has been on for years. So I think, yes, this whole war, if you want to call it a war, I wouldn't even call it a war. This destruction that's taking place in Gaza has shown up the weakness of international law generally, and international humanitarian law in particular. One of the things it has done as well, though, is it's pushed countries to recognise Palestine. I mean, there's 4 this year that have from Europe, 3 of them EU members that have recognised Palestine. Slovenia, Ireland, Spain from the EU, and also then outside the EU, but in Europe, Norway. So I think that it's actually done a great display. I'll tell you what, you see, if I was an Israeli myself, again, I'm not. I don't know how I would feel if I was. Certainly, if I was a Jewish person, I'd be really concerned at the way in which Jewish people are being portrayed with this particular war. Because the people who are fighting the war, the Zionists claim that they're speaking on behalf of Jewish people. I know many Jewish people in Ireland who are totally opposed to this, totally opposed to Zionism, totally opposed to oppression of anybody else and stealing land. But certainly, whatever they feel about Israel as a state, they're totally opposed to this particular war. Sounds like a moral argument rather than an academic argument. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Sorry to cut in there, Féilim. I'm just conscious that we're well over time. So I'm just going to ask one more time if anybody who hasn't contributed already, if they have any short questions or observations.
Well, maybe I would like to provide my observation of this Israel issue.
Grace, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that international law is weak in its enforcement mechanism, but it does not mean that international law does not exist. When we talk about international law, it's not just about the treaties that are written or that are signed by states, but also include customary international law. So the establishment of a state has to satisfy the essential elements of being a state, which are population, government, territory, and sovereignty. But at the same time, customary under the UN treaty, the recognition of a state should also be recognized by the vast majority of the UN members. So these two conditions should be simultaneously satisfied if Israel is to be established as a state and recognized by the international community. However, currently we see that one condition has been satisfied, or at least it's close to satisfaction. That is, most states have recognized Palestine as a state. However, the sovereignty, the government elements of a state of Palestine has not been satisfied yet, because Palestine has to struggle for it. It has to, by maybe not allowed by violent or use of force of means, but by non-violent means, it has to struggle for sovereignty, for its control or effective control of the territory. However, it hasn't achieved yet. So that's why it has not satisfied the customary international law norm to be a state yet. So, but even though, putting aside this issue, we still recognize the application of international humanitarian law and human rights law to Palestine and Israel in the Gaza Strip. So the International Criminal Court has already investigated the war crimes that have been committed by Israel in this area, even though Israel is not a member of ICC. But it founded its jurisdiction by the land that are controlled by the connection with Palestine, because Palestine is a member, and therefore the areas that are controlled by Israel of the Palestine territory is also under the investigation of ICC. So that is a way of, by expansion of jurisdiction, but it's also a way to exercise international law. So I still think that maybe the function is not very effective, but it does not mean that international law does not function. It might be playing a weak role, but I think it's still very important.
Okay, yeah, thank you, comment. Grace, for that. And I'm going to default. Thank you. And I see Yua has her hand up, so I'm going to take a final observation or comment from, or question even from Yua, and then bring the session to a close. So Yua.
Okay, yes, you hear me? Thank you very much. And a very short follow-up observation. Yes, and I think this follow-up observation with Grace, and what comes to me actually is like the one step back is about the legitimacy of international law. So yeah, previously we were thinking about, you know, the consent from the state would be very closely tied to the legitimacy of international law, but in the Israel and Palestine case, and we see that the consent from the state is not that important, or does not really play a role, since, you know, the decision-making power has been in the hands of these the real power or superpowers. They could decide the destiny or, you know, the fate of this Israel and in this area, district, especially the Palestinians. Yes, and so this is one consideration, and, you know, and also very closely to that, actually it seems now the authority of the international law is like inherently moral and political, and we can see, though the Israeli people has been criticized for its invasion into, you know, Gaza, or this enclosement of the Gaza, but, you know, and also like the international organizations like International Court, they have already, you know, ruled the behavior as, you know, illegal. But, you know, it seems that the lack of political power or enforcement power, I would say not political power, as political motivations from the international communities. And so that's why I think, yeah, the Israel people, they could defend, they could justify the actions in the name of, yeah, for security. So this is quite like the moral. And so now, yes, I think we need to have a reflection, you know, on this, the legitimacy of international laws. Yeah, very short observations. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, and Féilim, unless you want to make any very brief replies, because I'm conscious of the time.
Just a couple of things. One of the things that I would throw out, right? First of all, remember, I'm being as controversial as I can be in this to get people to think and to argue and to debate, right? I'm not
You're always
against
controversial.
I'm not against international law at all. I think international law is a good thing. My problem is that it's not implemented, and also how it's actually developed. Just to throw one thing out in relation to this, in Catalonia, there was a campaign for independence, a peaceful campaign for independence, right? The response of the Spanish state to that peaceful campaign for independence was to jail many people, a number of people actually, I'm talking about politicians as well as political activists, jail a number of them for a peaceful campaign to get independence. Now, the question then is, why should it be the case that the UN makes the decision on whether somebody is entitled to, some group of people is entitled to self-determination or not? Particularly whenever the UN makes that decision based on political and geopolitical concerns. And I'm just throwing this out as a question, not asking anybody here to answer it, because Joe would kill me if I was doing that, but just to ask people to think about it. You know, because why should a person's self-determination or a group of people's self-determination be determined by other people? Just throwing it out.
I'm going to leave Féilim with the last word. So thanks everybody. I appreciate we've gone over time, but it was important to give a reasonable airing to these topics, very complex topics, often very difficult topics, very political facets to these topics. So I want to thank our regular attendees. You know who you are. I want to welcome and thank people who are attending for the first few times, and there's some people who've joined since I opened the meeting, so thanks to them as well. And I see Dennis is there from Anchor as well, so another regular attendee, and some other attendees whose names I don't recognise. So welcome to everybody. Hope you've enjoyed this session. So thank you all. Thanks, of course, particularly to Féilim hAdhmaill from the School of Applied Social Studies in University College Cork in Ireland. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this series it occurs on the last Friday of every month around issues of law, human rights, a whole variety of topics under that very wide, spacious umbrella. And these sessions are hosted by the Human Rights Centre in Central South University in Changsha, People's Republic of China, and the lead coordinators, you might say, are ULE from the Human Rights Centre School of Law in Changsha, and a research fellow at the same research centre. So, as usual, thanks to them both. And the session has been recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel. Peter, thank you very much. As the link is circulated, no doubt we'll circulate the link again. And if I have my dates right, our next meeting, and with details to be confirmed of who will be presenting, will be, as I say, the last Friday in October, which is the 25th of October. And I guess, again, to keep an eye out, it should be at the same time, 1 p.m. Central European Time, and 7 p.m. Changsha time, if I have those details correct. So hope we see you all again Friday, 25th of October. So thanks to everybody again. Thanks again to Féilim. Thank you.